So, you've decided to take on a sourdough starter. Good for you. This is gonna be wonderful, but it's kind of like having a pet. Like any other pet, there are some tools you're gonna need. So today in this video, we're gonna cover tools you'll need and basic feeding principles, okay? So get yourself a digital scale. Any digital food scale will do, but when you're mixing and feeding your starter, you're gonna need to make sure that you're keeping a careful track of how much you're putting in. And do that using ratios. I'll explain that in a minute. You're gonna need a digital scale. Another thing you're gonna need is clean water. This is just regular tap water that's been boiled in my tea kettle, and every time that I've got a little left over, I top off this bottle, and that way it's always purified, clean of any, excessive chemicals or any contaminants. Another thing you're gonna need is just plain old all-purpose flour. You don't need anything fancy, you don't need anything bougie, just plain white, cheap, all-purpose flour for feeding your sourdough starter. When you get to the point of you're actually gonna make bread out of it, then you can add some flavor and you can do some funky things by adding different types of wheat. I really like to use dark rye as part of my flour mixture when I'm making sourdough. It brings out a lot of extra flavor. For the sourdough starter itself, you're gonna need an actual vessel. This is gonna be the house for your sourdough starter. It's the place that it lives. It's the thing that you're gonna feed it in. It's gonna grow, and then as it gets hungry, it'll shrink back down. Let me show you an example. So this is my sourdough starter vessel. And as you can see, all the sides are totally flat. And that's because I'm gonna be cleaning this thing 3 to 4 times a week. And so it's just easier if it's a vessel that's the size that I can fit my hand into to wash it out. And if it's totally straight and flat on the edges, it'll just make it much more simple for maintenance purposes. This is available on Amazon. If I can find a link for it, I'll put a link in the video. But I highly recommend that when you get your vessel for your sourdough starter, it needs to have a lid. It doesn't need to be airtight or locking or anything like that, but it needs to have a lid and it needs to have flat sides, okay? That'll make your life abundantly easier. Like this is cute. Using a ball or a mason jar is cute, but all those little crevices, all the little angles, it's just much, much harder to keep it clean and to wash it out quickly. You're gonna need something to stir your starter with. I like to use this bamboo wood chopstick. It's bamboo chopstick. Super simple. You're gonna need a scraper for various reasons. So I grab a small one like this. This was at the Dollar Tree for $1. Super simple. Also, a plastic scoops, plastic implements. There's this big debate as to whether or not it's acceptable to use metal because chemically, I'm pretty sure it's an old wives' tale, but theoretically, metal ruins sourdough. I haven't experienced that, but just to avoid any potential issues, I've always used plastic to feed my starter and to manipulate it. So that's basically it. Plastic cutlery, flour, cheap flour, water that's pure, a vessel with straight edges, and those are just some of the, and a scale. Those are the basics that you're gonna need in order to make sure that you have all the tools available to you to grow a sourdough starter well. Now, I'm gonna show you how to feed your sourdough starter. So, let's take a look at how that works. Now, it's not lost to me that I just told you not to use mason jars. And here I am using a mason jar. Well, do what I say and not as I do. So we're gonna put the empty vessel on the scale. We're gonna tear it out to 0 grams. Allegedly, there we go. Okay, we're gonna tear it out to 0 grams. There we go. Now, you're gonna take your starter. Now this starter is from my primary starter. And as you can see, it's really liquid. It kind of looks the consistency of pancake batter. And that means that it's really, really hungry right now. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take 1 part sourdough starter and I'm gonna add 2 parts water and 2 parts flour, okay? So here's what that looks like. I'm gonna take just a normal, kind of average, small amount. I'm gonna measure this out to 30 grams of starter, okay? 29, and come on. 30 grams of starter, okay? So if I'm doing 1 part starter, 2 parts water, 2 parts flour, that means I'm gonna add 60 grams of water and flour. So I'm gonna zero my scale out again. And here I've got my normal, average, everyday white, cheap flour, all-purpose flour, and I'm going to measure out 60 grams into my vessel. 60 grams. Okay. Now I've done that. I'm going to tare again, and I'm going to add 60 grams of my purified water. 15 more grams. There we go. Perfect. Well, it's a little off. It's going to be okay. So now I'll take my chopstick that I mentioned earlier. We're going to stir until everything is incorporated. Okay. So now it's not, see how this is a different consistency? It's not pancake batter consistency anymore. It's a little more liquid, but it's not soupy. You don't want it to be too soupy. You don't want it to be too liquid. This is where my scraper comes in. So I'm going to take my scraper and I'm going to clean off the sides just to make sure that everything's incorporated and so that I can have a clean line to measure the growth of my starter. Okay? Cleaning off the edges, cleaning off the sides, getting everything down. And now as you can see, I've got a nice clean line to see what size my starter was when I first fed it. So now I don't have a lid per se, but what I do have is a coffee filter and these rings. And so you can get primitive on this. You don't need to be like super bougie, super fancy with the way that you do all this. I mean, people have been making sourdough for thousands of years. So I've marked my line, and now I know how much sourdough starter I started with. And I can watch and measure its growth. Like, check this one out. This is a starter. This is my main starter that I fed this morning. And as you can see, when I first fed it, it was down here. And it's already almost doubled in size. That means that here in a little while, it's going to be totally usable, and I'll be ready to use it to make bread. So, those are the basics. Now, the manner in which I fed this guy, you want to do that every other day. You kind of need to watch and see how it responds. If it gets super liquidy like this one did, it's very, very hungry. If it's staying kind of like pillowy and you can see how there's all these air bubbles, like that's an indication that it's very active. It's multiplying well. All the chemical things that are supposed to be happening in sourdough are happening. And also you can see there's some condensation here. It's going to create warmth. Like as the sourdough feeds and creates carbon dioxide, it's going to be warm. You can see here, like we keep our house pretty cool, but this is taping out to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Our house is not that warm. And you can see here's the difference in consistency. See, it's a little more, like you can see the glutinous aspects of it. You can see the way that it doesn't pour, and the dynamics of it are different than this hungry starter. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Awesome. They're very forgiving. As long as you keep them in sort of a medium temperature place and they don't get too hot and they don't get too cold, then you can feed them every couple of days and it'll be okay. The thing you don't want is if you crack this thing open to feed it and it smells like human fart, then toss it. If it grows any pink or orange or black mold, toss it out. You got to start over from scratch. But for the most part, you're going to be able to feed this guy every other day or every 2 or 3 days, and it'll be okay. Sometimes a layer of film will grow across the top, and you just scrape it off and feed it again. Yeah, that's the basics to making sure it's fed. So remember, 1 part sourdough starter, 2 parts water, 2 parts flour. Mix it together, feed it like that every other day. You're going to have extra. That's okay. Dump it out, get rid of it. When I'm just feeding my starter and I'm not planning on making bread out of it anytime soon, I tend to keep it around 30 grams starter, 60 grams water, 60 grams flour. And that's just my basic feeding recipe. If I'm going to make a great deal of bread, then I might bump it up to like 50, 100, or even like 70, 140, 140. That way I'll have plenty of starter to make a whole mess of bread. All right. This has probably not been the most exciting video that you've ever seen, but I hope that it kind of gives you the basics. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And my next video will be about making the bread itself. Okay, Have fun.